image that you're able to see on camera is that of Pan Ku from Chinese mythology, and he holds the Tai Chi and turns this Tai Chi. And this is a Chinese version of the turning of the Dharma chakra. If you look at the way in which Pan Ku holds the Tai Chi, he turns it from the Anahata chakra, because the Anahata chakra has an ability to jump directly to the Saharastra chakra, so that the heart energy has the ability to go to transcendence directly. Generally, the rise of energy will follow a sequence of the 7 chakras and culminate with the Saharastra. But after a long reflection about the Saharastra chakra, one comes to understand that the Saharastra chakra is actually not located on the human body, but above it. And the ancient way in which this was symbolically presented was in the Egyptian form of having the hawk, Horus, who carries in one of its talons the symbol of eternity, flying just over the head of the person. In the Indus civilization, the hawk was taken by, its place was taken by the serpent, by the snake, by the naga, because the snake is the complement to the hawk or the eagle, so that whenever you see the deep symbolic complementation, one sees an eagle and a snake, and they go together. The Western psyche has this kind of combination, hawk and eagle, hawk or eagle and snake or serpent, whereas the Chinese see it, the serpent is dragon, and in place of the hawk or the eagle, one sees a tiger. Or in ancient China, before the tiger was worked into Chinese symbology, it was the phoenix, a bird, which shows that the most archaic Chinese symbolic level was actually interpenetrative with the West. So that back in the early dynastic period of China, in the Xia dynasty, which in the books on Chinese history you find almost nothing, because the Xia are like a phantom beginnings of dynastic China. One knows more about the mythic kings before the Xia dynasty than the Xia dynasty itself, about 2200 BC. The Xia dynasty being contemporaneous with the Zarathustra of ancient Iran, with the grandsons of Sargon of Akkad of Sumeria. And there one finds the phoenix and the dragon. But later, in Chinese lore, one begins to find the tiger and the dragon. But let's come back. Let's come back to the Saharastra chakra, symbolized in Egyptian version of wisdom by the hawk, the Horus figure, symbolized in India by the Naga, usually the Naga king. And the epitome of presenting the Naga king over the Saharastra chakra occurs in the earliest renditions of the Buddha, his enlightenment. And I'll give that symbolic ritual to you in just a moment, recorded in the Mahavagga, the Great Vagga way, or life, the great life. Let's talk just for a moment longer about how the Saharastra chakra is above the crown of the skull. That is not on the skull, but above the crown. And this, in ancient wisdom traditions, was always that there was an opening here in the skull, that when babies are born, there's a soft spot here, that the skull is not completely hardened, not completely fossilized, not completely frozen into its form, so that the skull of a baby has a soft spot here. And that ancient wisdom was always to keep this open, to keep this spot on the crown open, so that the Saharastra is called the crown chakra, not because the chakra is located on the crown, but because the openness of the crown leads to or yields the Saharastra chakra. So that in certain meditations where one is raising one's energy, filling chakra after chakra, and rising, the energy does not stop with the pate of the head, but rises above it. And one can do this in 3 different ways. You can do it with abject terror. You can do it with profound ecstasy. And you can do it with transcendental wisdom. That there is a 3-pronged way to show the transcendence. And this is where transcendence comes in. Transcendence means going beyond the senses, going beyond the body. And the Saharastra chakra being located just above your head. If you are frightened, quote, to death, frightened, quote, out of your wits, what happens if you keep track of it meditatively is that you leave your body. And your sense of presence hovers here at the Saharastra chakra. If you do it in slow motion, if you experience abject terror in slow motion, you will fill up with feelings of dread all the way to the pate of the head, and then an effortless presence occurs. And while one's body is completely filled with terror, you, in your presence, are not. You float just above the head in the Saharastra with effortless grace. The Greek word for this is charis, grace. And it's this grace that is the benediction of realization, called in Greek epiphany, and it means the realization of transcendence. The Saharastra chakra can be activated from the heart, from the Anahata chakra. And so Panku holds the Tai Chi here at the Anahata chakra, and when the Tai Chi is turned so that there is a complete revolution in a single instance, one could be at the Saharastra chakra immediately from the Anahata energy. This goes back in the Western wisdom tradition to a ritual which is recorded in its fullest completeness in the Mahavagga. And there's a translation of the Mahavagga in the Sacred Books of the East, volume 13. It's called Vinaya Texts, Sacred Books of the East, volume 13. And I think there are 3 volumes of Vinaya texts in the Sacred Books of the East. This would be in the first. And the first contains the Mahavagga, the great life. And in that are 4 trees. which are the 4 quarters of wholeness, which are the 4 phases of integration, which the Buddha undergoes for his enlightenment, his final enlightenment. Remember that the Buddha at age 28, 4 sevens, at the age of 28, had a disenchantment with the world, had led a protected life, is symbolic of the kind of naivete that we have because we accept the safety, so-called, of the world given to us. And only occasionally does one get a glimpse that the safety which tradition hands us is safe only as long as tradition lasts. And when anything occurs outside of the reach of tradition, like death or birth or afterlife or sheer terror or fantastic ecstasy or transcendental wisdom, when any of these occur, the reach of the security of tradition is breached and cannot extend. And yet, our capacity as a being extends to all of these realms and variants of these realms that are even now as yet unnamed, though they occur and can occur and will occur. And their discovery is as certain as tomorrow's sunrise. There are states of feeling and states of mind, states of thought that are so delicate that the names are not well known even to experts. And there are those states and feelings and thoughts that are yet to be discovered, whose names have never been uttered in any language. We're talking about all this in order to understand why it is that ritual is essential to integration, and yet there is a ratcheting up of the order of maturation. There is a stepping up of the powers of a human being, which makes a bifurcation of the possibility of ritual, where one road, one part of the bifurcation leads to peril, and the other leads to transcendence. So that there is a regression, which is perilous, which occurs paired to the transformation, which is transcendent. And that at the time of it happening, there is no way to tell the difference whatsoever. Paired ways are resonant, and the resonance is usually the way in which one tells the difference in an integral natural mode. But when the resonance is the same, when they are paired so that they are not just parallel, but that they occur together, unbroken, there is no way that the natural integral way of making distinctions holds, and one needs to shift to a different way, a different mode. One has to have a differential instead of an integral method of determining distinctness. And differential distinctness is, while complementary to the integral, radically different. One has to learn to feel differently, to think differently, and to be differently. And the being different is the most difficult of all. Thinking differently is the easiest, feeling differently is the next hardest, and being different is the most hardest. And then on the scale of wholeness, the Everest of it all is to let difference be. And that's uncannily difficult. For now, it's easier for us just to talk about, in this particular ritual lecture, this presentation, how it is that by our examples of a pair of texts, the Satipatthana Sutra of the historical Buddha, and the Bacchae, a Greek tragedy by Euripides, disclose to us in a pair the key to understanding this whole mysterious ensemble that we've been talking about this morning. An ensemble that includes transformation, includes mystery, includes transcendence, but also includes the intricacies of ritual more than anything else. So we need to remind ourselves of a basic compass, a way of keeping track, at least initially, of what's going on. And the way to keep track, initially, is to remember that wholeness has a geometry. It has a four-part geometry to it. And while there is a center to this geometry, and the center can occur as the rim, and there can be a vanished center, and there can be a rim that is boundless. Nevertheless, the four-part geometry of wholeness holds all the way to transformation, holds all the way to transcendence, so that in the integral realm of the universe, a four-part structure, a wholeness in quarters, a cycle in 4 seasons, holds its structure and is able to be used and useful in talking about, in thinking about, in feeling about how we educate ourselves to full maturity. That 4-part cycle begins in nature. Its first movement is in ritual. Its second movement is in myth, and its third movement is in symbol. So that nature, ritual, myth, and symbol, the shape of our whole first year of education, are a shape of integral wholeness. It's a cycle of completeness, and it has its mysteries. It has its mysteries at the beginning, and all the way through, and at the end. But those mysteries can be suspended, and we can talk about the 4 parts, about that 4-part cycle, about those 4 phases. And we have. But we broached the subject last week about how, as one discovers a new realm, the realm of vision, that as vision is discovered, nature subsides into the background. For the 4 phases, the 4 cycles of wholeness are all that can be kept track of at any one time. And if a new phase is brought into the form of wholeness, a previous phase that was there fades into the background, so that the most that a form can hold, the most that a presentational completeness can hold, is this 4-part, this quaternary geometry, the 4-part cycle. And as a new phase joins that form, a previous phase slips into the background. It does not disappear except to visibility. It does not go away except to immediacy. It becomes invisible, and in this way, as vision rises, nature subsides into invisibility. So that a new 4-part structure occurs. One that is begun with ritual rather than nature, for nature now has joined the background. Vision has come out of the background into the foreground, into the form. And as a complement, as one comes forth, the most farthest back one recedes into the background. So that where nature was first, now ritual. And so the form of wholeness is ritual, myth, symbol, and vision. And that wholeness is very stable. But there is a difference, and the difference is radical. When nature was the beginning of the cycle, integration was assured its progress, its natural evolution, because nature itself was a process. But when that four-part cycle begins with ritual, ritual is an objectivization. Instead of a process, it's something objective. So the cycle is no longer purely natural. It's no longer purely integral. It begins with ritual and develops through the alternate process of myth, the alternate process of objectivization, another alteration back to process. So there's always this sine wave weaving. And at the crests of the sine wave are objective states. And at the lower dip of the sine wave are processes. So there are phases where objectivization happens, and there are phases where process occurs, where flow is more important than the thing. So when the process of wholeness begins with nature, we begin with a flow. And so integration has a flow quality to it. Whereas the cycle of wholeness that begins with ritual has an objectivization with it, and that object that holds that form is existence. And so it's important to keep in mind that when existence is the arbiter of wholeness, one has already incorporated vision into the form, and one already, whether you know it or not, assumes that ritual founds the cycle. So that on the tribal level, on the level of tradition, ritual is the foundation and not nature. Which is why the detailed attention to ritual, that ritual must get it right, tradition, tribal wisdom, depends on the accuracy of ritual to found the cycle of wholeness. And while they do that, vision has a bifurcation tendency. Like all dynamic qualities in the differential mode, it has an equal opportunity to go two different ways, to either go forward more or to regress or become recursive. The difference between regression and recursive is a conscious navigating back in order to make adjustments, in order to make modifications for something in the differential field, whereas regression is an unconscious or a subconscious reversion, a reverting back without consciousness. Generally in wisdom traditions, one would call the regression without consciousness, one would call that black magic or sorcery. Whereas the forward movement of vision, one would simply call consciousness. So that to make a distinction, one could say there is a distinction differentially between consciousness and sorcery. In a certain usage, I believe in the French language it's pronounced legerdemain, magic. It's the magic of the bodily movement. In a good magician, movements of the hand, movements of the body, can be geared in such a way as to elicit from us an automatic response. so that our eye sees what it expects to see, because that's the way nature works. But a magician can modify, can weave in between the natural movements of the hand, of the arms, of the body. Weave in between those natural movements conscious subtext movements, so that someone who is just following the natural response will only see the natural movements. The conscious magic movements will be invisible to their eye. They will not be able to see them because they are woven in as a subtext. Thus, to a tradition-bound person, the movement of consciousness is invisible and cannot be seen, cannot be recognized at all. And the effects that occur from consciousness are to them completely magical, unaccounted for. When a regression takes place, when vision, which is transcendent and is the concluding fourth part of a cycle begun by ritual, when vision regresses, its tendency is to regress back to the last stable objective phase. So when vision becomes regressive, it tends to become regressive back to symbol. And symbol would be the natural first place that regression lodges. The mind, the symbols of the mind, the ideas of thought become the first place where regression lodges itself. But most people, most thinking beings, whether on this planet or any other planet in any other star system, have the same problem. The problem is that the mind is not trained well enough to hold ideas firm enough and long enough for the regression to really take place and set in, because the ideas have not been firmly held. The mind's structure is not firmly held, so the regression falls out of the mind and falls back into the next phase where it would record. And the next phase is language. But language is a process. It's like nature. It's like vision itself. It's a process. And language in its process distributes dynamically the regression all the way through. And because it is not an objective phase, the regression precipitates all the way back through language, back to the next objective level, which is existence, the body, which is ritual. And so regression almost inevitably, initially, registers in the body, in ritual. And so one can diagnose regression by looking foremost at what is being done. A doctor of civilization, in order to diagnose the disease, will look at the ritual comportment. It's like the pulse test of the Chinese doctor. If you hold your sensitivity to the actual what is going on, ritual comportment, you can there, with experience and knowledge, read exactly what is going on with the patient. This is why the Mindfulness Sutra of the Buddha. The Mindfulness Sutra is the visionary transcendental way of taking the pulse of existence. It is the way in which someone who is transcendentally aware checks out the actuality of the situation, not the situation of thought or of feeling or even of tradition, but the actual complete state of the integral mode. More than existence, everything in the integral mode. And because consciousness is intimately woven, the ancient way in speaking of transcendental expression was that one spoke woven words. One's words were woven back into the fabric, the geometry of integration. One's wovenness in language can be used as a thread to go back and make this conscious check on ritual comportment and there read what the integral cycle is actually doing, what it is showing. So that while in the treasury of world civilization there are many ways to do this, the easiest way to learn it initially is from the Satipatthana Sutra of the historical Buddha. And the reason why it is the easiest, one might almost say the purest, simplest ABCD way of understanding is that the Buddha himself, by the way in which he reached enlightenment, reached it by a ritual comportment that is quite extraordinarily accurately available to developing this Satipatthana method. In brief, the way the Buddha got enlightened set him up to be a genius at diagnosing ritual comportment as the barometer, as the pulse of existence. So one would like to ask a question, well, how did this happen? The general myth is that the Buddha sat underneath the Bodhi tree and was enlightened. This doesn't do much for us. We can go to the Bodhi tree that's growing in back here of this center, the Bodhi tree bookstore, and there is a Bodhi tree in the backyard. And you can sit there forever. And you will not become a Buddha. It's not like the monkey who's going to write King Lear. It's not possible to do it. Why? Because the Buddha himself did not just sit under the Bodhi tree and gain enlightenment. For instance, the exactness of the ritual is itself the only trustworthy guide to how the actuality of it occurred. And the actuality of it is recorded in the Mahavagga with great exactness. So that when you go to the Mahavagga, you find that after 28 years of life, after 4 cycles of 7 years, the historical Siddhartha, Gautama, became disenchanted with what he had been given as the discussion, the security, the way in which one understood that life is what we do. Not what others do, but what we do. And he discovered by going outside of the courtyard of the palace, outside of the walls of the princely life, the privileged, aristocratic, noble class which he was born into, the Sakya clan. He went out with a servant who became very famous in Buddhist lore. His name was Channa. And Channa accompanied the Buddha on a midnight excursion out into the rest of the city and for the first time saw sick people for the first time saw poor people, for the first time saw human beings die, and realized that he had lived in a false world, that he was living in a false world, that it was only as good as the power of the royal court to extend its walls, and outside of that, the rest of the universe was subject to natural laws of impoverishment, maiming, disease, death, unhappiness in the most general form. And so the Buddha, the future Buddha, gave up his courtly life and left his young son Raula, left his mother, left his wife, left the royal throne which was available to him in time, and with Channa as his charioteer rode off south from where he lived, and after several days they came to a great river, the Ganges, and crossed over. And the Buddha himself left Channa on the one shore, and he went over to the other side and began a fifth cycle of 7 years. And in that fifth cycle of 7 years, he progressively used the wrong approach. He progressively weeded out what he did, because that was the only form available to him. He obviously had been doing things wrongly, and so he stopped doing things and finally pared it down to where the only thing that he had left to give up was eating. And so he gave up food, and in a completely weakened condition, emaciated, fell in the dust to die. A peasant woman, seeing this fairly young man, still only about 35, completely skeleton, laying in the dust, went over and took some rice that she had and moistened it with her own saliva and literally pasted it into Siddhartha's mouth until he was able to swallow, and she nursed him back to enough health to where he could sit up. He sat under the Bodhi tree in this condition, completely shaken. And under the Bodhi tree, he sat for 7 days. And as he sat for 7 days, what occurred to him was the chain of causation, the praditya samutpaya, the law of dependent causation, which has a 12-stage cycle. And he saw that this cycle is like a wheel, but it's like a wheel that is flawed. For this wheel itself assumes that there is an axle of destiny, an axle of karma that turns this wheel. And under the Bodhi tree, he saw that in fact this wheel of dependent causation was independent of any axle. That it happened automatically because of the conditions of the rim of the cycle and was not dependent at all upon anything turning it. That in fact there was no center, there was only the chain of causation. And therefore, any penetration from this chain of causation towards the center stopped the chain of causation. And one of the stages along the way, the stage at which he stopped it, was the stage of ignorance. And as he interiorized beyond traditional ritual comportment ignorance, the whole chain of dependent causation stopped. It collapsed, and it left in its place nothing, absolutely nothing. So that under the Bodhi tree, for 7 days, the future Buddha had meditated on this, And at the end of 7 days, he got up from the Bodhi tree and he walked over to a second of 4 trees. The second tree was a banyan tree, the Agapala banyan tree. Sometimes in Buddhist lore remembered as a goat herd tree, because this particular tree was used as shade. Banyan trees spread out quite a ways, and traditional goat herds at that time were sheltered under the tree for shade. The Buddha went under this Agapala banyan tree and sat for another 7 days. And while he was sitting there, a young man of haughty disposition came up to him and asked him a pair of questions, 2 questions leading to a third question. He asked, by what? By what? And what are the characteristics of becoming a Brahmana that make a man a Brahmana, that cause man to transform into a Brahmana, into a visionary? Now, the by what is a question of what is the cause. And causality, as we will see, is always a projection. The expectation of a causality, the detection of a causality, is always a projection. It's a projection by an ego of a regressive visionary ritual comportment. The asking of the cause is actually a form of black magic. The second question, which is, what are the characteristics, is an identity projection. What are the characteristics? It's like asking, what is the spec list? In order to make the identification. If we don't have the spec list, we cannot make the identification. Which means, of course, that there's no ability to instantly, spontaneously intuit reality, but one is reduced regressively back to having to check a list of specs to determine what this is, and then to compare what this is with another item that has the same spec list, and therefore they must be identical, and this is a deep flaw. Also a projection always. So that causality, the belief in causality, is an illusion, and the belief in identity is a delusion. An illusion is something that you missee, and a delusion is something that you misbelieve on the basis of misseeing. And the third aspect is a complete misunderstanding of transcendence as transposition. How do I get from here to there without understanding that the you that's here is quite radically different from the you that's there? And thinking only that you're going to transpose yourself from here to there, keeping the you in the meantime. So that instead of transcendence, one has transposition. And the transposition seems perfectly natural because it's misidentified as reciprocity on the ritual level, and it seems perfectly natural. And one doesn't notice the difference at all. In fact, the ego never knows. It never learns the difference. So that a simple transposition satisfies the ego because it reminds them of the reciprocity necessary for ritual existence, and doesn't understand that transcendence opens up a completely radical, different quality, and that one cannot just simply transpose. So under the Agapala banyan tree, the Buddha was asked by this haughty young man how he can get from where he is to where the Buddha is. How do I get to where you are? And immediately in the Buddha's sentience, came this vision that self-restraint mastery occurs, and when it occurs, the who that was there is transformed into a selflessness. The phrase in the Mahavagga is a selflessness that finds its selflessness no longer uneven with nothing in the world. That's the elegant way in which it says. That the selflessness has an evenness, an equilibrium with the Tao of the world. And so it flows. And so vision flows not in a regression back to ritual, but it flows in a wholeness onto the invisible nature, back to the background. And so one has this 5-part quintessential mystery, 4 parts of which are seeable as form, and a 5th part which is not seeable, but nevertheless occurs in the real, so that the background and the form occur together. And when you have differentially included the background with the form not only is there, but the background also. And so one's awareness is not just of the form of oneself, but of the contextual background in which you occur. And that's why it's called Buddha nature. The radical transcendence, the Saharastra level, is the context, the background of it all, of any form whatsoever. Let's take a break and then we'll come back. So we come back to a form which now we can make a realization. For we have an attention that exceeds form, and because our attention now transcendently exceeds form, we can recognize the complete form because our attention includes enough context surrounding the form to show the form complete. A regression of energy is like a short circuit. It goes back, and instead of moving on in a flow, it regresses back and cinches. And so the cycle of wholeness, instead of being open to further development, now is cinched closed as a circle. A limited circle, a rut. And because the rut has the 4-part phases, the cycle of 4 phases, and we know from our educational structure here that each phase has a tertiary or 3-part structure, the entire circle of regression has 4 phases of 3 parts each, or a 12-part structure, which is the 12-part structure of the cycle of ignorance, the Patitya Samutpaya. So this 12 phases of the cycle of samsara are generated by, triggered by, not by nature, not by the process of integration, but by a false move where transposition rather than transcendence has been chosen. And this due not to anything malign, but from having made the wrong choice. And so the great realization of the historical Buddha of Siddhartha, now become enlightened, now awakened, now in a state of grace, the Blessed One, Charis, understanding that what has occurred can be changed, can be rectified by education, but that the education must be complete enough to make the change. It must be not just an adjustment, but a radical redoing by tracing through the integration the way it would happen naturally and allowing the moment of transcendence to occur and choosing the transcendent rather than the regressive. Opening up the short circuit to a further flow of current, a further development. Just as the embryo in the womb undergoes all the phases of evolution, and at the moment of birth enters into the phase where human beings occur in evolution, so too a wisdom education takes us back through the pattern of maturation and allows us to re-parent in an exacting way. But not just to reparent in terms of somebody's mind or mental setup, or even included in that somebody's mind and somebody's feeling, the way in which one feels language and all of its complexities, but deeper, more inclusive, the whole structures of existence, the whole objectivization of the body. But deeper than that yet, to recover nature, to recover that primordiality, that mysterious process, that zero-based Tao, so that it is integrated also into the entire cycle. So that what one has then in a wisdom education is radically different from anything else, in that it is not a thing, but it's more than everything. Let's go back, let's retrace, let's look at the Buddha's traditional historical maturation in the Mahavagga. 4 trees, the Bodhi tree, 7 days. The Agapala banyan tree, 7 days. Then a third tree called the Muchalinda tree. And under the Muchalinda tree, as tradition records, as the cosmic myth of enlightenment flows on, that third 7-day cycle was a severe thunderstorm. Lightning, thunderstorm. The historical Buddha gained his enlightenment in the foothills of the Himalayas, and there are thunderstorms there that rival those of the American Midwest. And while he was seated under the Muchalinda tree, and this tremendous storm came up and raged for the entire week, the entire 7 days, a giant Naga king, a king cobra, huge. King cobras get to be about 25 feet long, enormous, wrapped itself 7 times, its coils 7 times around the Buddha's body, and rested its great crested hood over his head, so that the hood of the king cobra occupied the locus, the focus of the Buddha's Saharastra chakra, and he being in complete equanimity, the resonance of the king cobra became that of enlightenment. And so they sat together, and if one would have looked at the figure of Siddhartha Gautama from the outside, one would have feared for his very existence. A man completely buried by the suffocating coils of the serpent whose head was poised over his own, The man was completely done for. Right? Wrong. I wish I could imitate Dennis Hopper, who could say wrong in the right way. Wrong. It's not that. I want to tell you it's not that. You got it wrong. In the Western Hermetic tradition, when one looks at that symbol of a man enveloped by the 7 coils of the serpent with the hood over it, with the head there where the Horus carrying eternity would be, one sees that symbol in the Western Hermetic tradition as the Orphic egg. The best illustration of it is in Manly Hall's great encyclopedia of symbolism. There's a cut in there from an old English Renaissance book on the Orphic egg. And the Orphic egg is surrounded by the great serpent. Now this goes back not just to ancient Hermetic West traditions, back 4,000 years ago, back to 2000 BC in the ancient Mediterranean Near East, but occurs profoundly in many places of the world. The largest surviving earth mound in North America is along the Ohio River, where the great serpent is about 100 and some feet long, and its head is an open mouth, and there is an oval, which would be the egg. And so the ancient North American Indians who occupied the Ohio Valley at that time, some 1,000 years ago, also put the serpent and the egg there. That egg, that celestial egg, that's the completeness of chaos, bound together as a form, as a fertile protean form. Chaos can be fertile, and what would the egg of chaos give birth to if it were hatched? It gives birth to cosmos. And so in the ancient mystery tradition of wisdom, the serpentine energy of life, when it completely envelops us and we remain in equanimity, it transforms from a regressive peril to a progressive transcendence, to an awakening, to an enlightenment, to a quality where the next phase comes into play. And what it would be the next phase? What is the next phase in our education? Following vision will come to art. And art always has to do with the person. A work of art always shows us there is an artist nearby. Louis Sullivan murmured to the young Frank Lloyd Wright one time. He said, "Wright, behind every building you see is an architect that you don't see, but without the architect you wouldn't have the building. Behind every Rembrandt in the world is Rembrandt himself." And so colossally conscious was Rembrandt that he painted his own portrait throughout his life. You can follow the self-portraits of Rembrandt as a record of consciousness. Great, perhaps the greatest figure of the Renaissance outside of Shakespeare is Rembrandt. And Rembrandt's self-portraits, for it is the portrait, the artistic portrait, that allows the re-emergence of the face, the individualization of the face, out of what had become a chaos. A chaos where the face had been merged with the mask. When face and mask become indistinguishable, that's a chaos. And left in a short circuit, it is the basis of illusion and delusion. But that same chaos, that same mulching together, that same mixing of face and mask, if brought into a differential growth, yields the reemergence of the face in the artistic portrait, the person themselves. But when art emerges, that four-part structure that began with ritual, remember the original four-part structure began with nature, and then nature was displaced by vision. And regressively, cinched into a closed circle, ritual, myth, symbol, and vision now become just magic. But when magic is vision and can grow, a sixth phase opens up, the phase of art. And as art emerges, ritual submerges. Ritual joins nature in the background. And so that cycle, then, that four-part form is myth, symbol, vision, art. And at that level, one has like the Renaissance, one has the quality where the fullness of one's differential, one's conscious person begins with the right use of language, the right use of the mythic horizon. For as the natural curvature of the earth is followed by the curve of the ritual seasons, making a ritual year, so that the wholeness of the planet is topped by the circle of the ritual year, so too language flows and distributes itself in a great circle. And one has almost this target of the planet of nature in the center. And then one has the circle of ritual wholeness, the circle of mythic wholeness, the integrity of language, the fertile capacity of language to engender experience. And the intelligent structure, the geometry of experience, is always there in the way in which language forms operate. So that expressive feeling are the bones of experience. Feeling. And the cue, the vibrant linking together of art and myth, of art and language together, of keeping that form vibrant. One of the great cues in that is the transformation of the drum of ritual music into the beat of the development of symphonic music. One has the development, and symphonic music doesn't come full-blown all the way. One sees the beginning because the structure of rhythm is portioned out into a feeling-toned expressive structure, the first musical form of which is the motet. And one can see, as recently as 400 or 500 years ago, one hears the delightful dances of Michael Praetorius, but one is able also to hear a radical difference in the motets of Palestrina. And for one of the first times in Palestrina, one becomes available for a personal quality of music that was unheard of before. And someone like a Palestrina can arrange a sequence of motets so that the entire Song of Songs, for instance, was presented musically. something as esoteric and mysterious as the Song of Songs, presented 500 years ago by Palestrina as a cycle of motets. And it is the development of the motet, of musical forms of the voice, structured out into expressive, experimental reaches of experience become artistically whole, that reached a culmination. The culmination of the motet was in the 1570s, a man named Thomas Tallis. And for the coronation of Elizabeth I of England, ushering in the Elizabethan period, Thomas Tallis, for his coronation, wrote a 40-part motet. The human ear cannot distinguish a 40-part motet, no matter how sophisticated you are. But the human mind can patiently learn to understand every part of the 40-part motet, and in fact understand it well enough to conduct the singing of it at the coronation of Elizabeth. And Tallis's great 40-part motet ushered in the great English Renaissance, the Elizabethan realm, because it showed in one grand epic move the way in which the motet was ready for a further advance. And that further advance comes not from yet another more grandiose musical form, but the further advance came from the jewel-like perfection of the lyric. Someone like a Thomas Campion, who was able to write Elizabethan lyric songs of such lilting, delicate nuance as to present accurately the feelings in a musical portrait of states of nuance, of elegant love that had never been expressed before. One finds in Shakespeare's plays the traces of the songs of Thomas Campion, punctuating, like the haiku of Basho in Japan, the exquisite personal qualities of love. And for the first time, one has available a development of art which brings myth into a portrait of the elegance of a new form of being. Shakespeare, in his wonderful play, A Midsummer Night's Dream. You know, one English critic, Geoffrey Bullough, wrote 8 volumes on the sources of Shakespeare's plays and could never find the source of Midsummer Night's Dream. Oh, there were some indications, but evidently one had to confess that A Midsummer Night's Dream must have come from the man himself. It's one of the great disappointments of the egotistical critic to finally have to realize that maybe someone discovered something new for themselves. It's like the search for the Q document, the Gospel of Jesus, that somehow all the Gospels were based on some kind of Q document from the German Quellen, meaning source, that this source document must be found. And couldn't it be possible that there was a man, that the man himself might be the origin? Anyway, extraordinarily, Shakespeare himself wrote A Midsummer Night's Dream from his feeling tones, because by the time Shakespeare was ready to write A Midsummer Night's Dream in the 1590s, some generation, some 20 years after Thomas Tallis's 40-part motet, English feeling capacity had filigrated itself to the level of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. It was possible for someone to express a portrait with the musical nuances of a 40-part motet in a drama. But A Midsummer Night's Dream is complemented exactly by Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. Comes about the same time. Because the Faustus is the theme that same energy that leads to the conscious, magical transformation of mythic times into the art of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream also has a great parallel that one could go back into a Faustian closed circle, where instead of the closed circle being on a ritual level, the closed circle on the Faustian level begins with the wrong language, the wrong use of language, the black magical use of language. And had it not been for an unfortunate fight in a bar that ended red-haired Christopher Marlowe's life when he was just about 30-some years old, it would have been interesting to see the maturation of the man who would have given Shakespeare a run for his money. There is a quality to Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, unfortunately not captured by the film with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton at all, but in the play, there's a quality of Marlowe's Dr. Faustus which elicited, a couple of hundred years later, a whole lifetime search by Goethe to unravel completely the cycle of ignorance that this closed circle of black magic misused language leads to. And one of the great triumphs of Goethe is to unwaveringly for 60 years follow not only the conscious form in the first part of Faust, but to delve into and elicit out from himself the unconscious background of the second part of Goethe's Faust. And when you put the two parts together, one has a cycle of transcendental wholeness that staggered the world. One of the few people at the time who was whole enough to recognize the entirety of it was Schiller. And when Schiller saw the ability of his friend Goethe to even essay bringing out the subconscious half of what was a conscious nightmare, Schiller wrote his Ode to Freedom, mistranslated as Ode to Joy, because it showed that man's capacity to understand the transcendent was beginning to broach upon cosmic levels, that man's maturity was that he was going to be able to fly in the winds of consciousness, like once he had walked with certainty on the ritual solidity of the earth. People like Hegel and Beethoven, understanding this, rallied to this ability. What cosmos, then, would conscious man fly in? But that's a long way from us. That's a year away from us. What we're at now is the more important to us now ability to understand that in a regression, the regression always goes to the next objective level, mature enough to sustain the regressive energy. If the mind is mature enough to sustain it, the regression lodges in the mind. If the mind is not mature enough, strong enough, it lodges in the body. So that in a more natural, traditional person, you would have a heart attack. In a more developed, supra-traditional person, you would have madness. And this becomes then, death and madness, become the two prongs of a pitchfork that holds man in abject terror of any further development, because more energy would just make it worse. Because the closed circle just takes more energy and redistributes it so that everything becomes stronger. So there's a knack, there's a trick. Without the ability to transform, just having more energy invites severer neuroses, more compelling psychoses. And so, by and large, a trapped population of beings in a neurotic short circuit will always resist any development of energy, any education which develops that energy, and they do it quite both naturally and unnaturally, to defend themselves against getting into deeper water. And so a little learning is indeed a dangerous thing. And all halfway educations lead to worse problems. And the very first thing that turns up in a therapia is that the problems become worse because the energy is higher and everything is exacerbated. So woven into a true therapia is the educational strategy which leads to the encouragement of the visionary capacity at the same time as the strengthening of better ritual comportment. In our case here, the better ritual comportment is just to show up every Saturday without hitch, regardless of what's going on, regardless of what's happening, regardless of other commitments, of other possibilities, because that is the seal. It's the seal on the ritual comportment that the process is continuing to form. And at the same time, as that seal happens, is the invitation to envision more energetically a wider scope. And those two processes at the same time are like forming hands. And they hold us in such a way that when we're ready, we can fly free. They do not hold us to constrain, but they hold us up to take off when we are capable. Let's come back to the Buddha. Let's come back to the traditional, the 4 7-day cycle, the 4 trees. A tree is a natural antenna. Any tree that has a structure of branches like this will have a complementary root structure to go with it. And so a tree is a natural receiver. It's an energy receiver. It's made to condense the energy that it receives. A great forest, if one is able to meditate and join the forest, if one is able to be a Thoreau who stands with the trees, you can feel the quality of the way in which a forest focuses and condenses together. And the deep quiet of a forest is a vibrant, lush, amphitheatrical silence. It's not a dead silence. It's not an empty room silence, but it's a great, hushed, a distant waterfall fullness, as someone once wrote. The Chinese poet Han Shan wrote about canyons that seemingly empty reverberate with the sound of the world. This quality was there in the 7-day cycles of the 4 trees of the Buddha. And from his Muchalinda tree, characterized by the Naga king who had held his 7 coils around the body and his hood over, the Buddha then went for a 4th 7-day cycle, 7 days under the Bodhi tree, 7 days under the Agapala banyan tree, 7 days under the Muchalinda tree, then 7 days under the Raja Yatanya. Raja is like a king. Raja Yatanya, it means the touch that brings the nobility out. And when he was under the Raja Yatanya tree is when the 2 merchants came by. The 2 traveling merchants. Their names are recorded, Tapusa and Balika. kind of like a Buddhist Mutt and Jeff. Two very ordinary, unextraordinary guys. Notice that the original Buddhist teaching is not to monks, but to two ordinary guys who just sat down with him, because under the Rajayatana tree, which was very near there to the general concourse, the high road, and when they sat down, they mixed rice and honey together and offered it to the yogi who was meditating there. Share with us, share our meal. And it turns out that rice and honey are the epitome of natural foods from that part of the world, that time of the world, northern India at that time. Rice and honey, like the old biblical milk and honey, which were natural foodstuffs there. It's the symbolic pairing together of the natural food, the natural diet, which brings out the mask of food that's akin to that. And the mask of food that would be there for rice and honey is a gentle, natural nutritiousness. And when presented with rice and honey, what occurred in the Buddha was not a mask that went on the face, because the Buddha was no longer there as an identification, no longer there as an objective thing, no longer there as some kind of causal identification. What occurred in the pure mind of the Buddha was a bowl. And the bowl that occurred was not a bowl that was made from man-made items like wood or ceramics, but it was a bowl of stone. And it was not a single bowl of stone, but it was 4 bowls of stone. So in the pure mind of the Buddha, when presented with a mixture of rice and honey, he reciprocated. His enlightened being reciprocated with the image of 4 stone bowls, sat down together. And so the Buddha ate with the 2 merchants and began just conversing with them. Now, in later monkish terminology, this is the sermon that was said to belong not to the triad, not to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, not to the 3 great structure, but to the dyad. There was only the Buddha and the Dharma. There was no Sangha yet. But this is a monkish regression. This is a misunderstanding carried on now for some 2,500 years and seen as a regression some 2,000 years ago. Because in the beginning of the Mahayana, the figure who founds the Mahayana, who brings the open cosmic form of the Mahayana into being, Ashvaghosha, whose name means in ancient Sanskrit the neighing, whinnying sound of the horse. A champion horse that in its energy whinnies. Ashvaghosha was like that. And his initial language was formed into a presentation of faith in the Mahayana. The Shraddha of the Mahayana. And that the faith is not a faith of doctrine, but it is a kind of transcendent faith which is there like the 4 stone bowls in the psyche of the Buddha. In the enlightened space of the Buddha, the image of the 4 stone bowls happens because there is a reciprocity in the universe as its natural structure, and so one has faith in that. Not that you hope it's going to happen, not that you have planned that it's going to happen, Not that you have coerced by ritual that it's got to happen. It's not a gamble. It's not a coercion, and it's not wishful. It happens. It happens because reciprocity is a natural concurrence in the universe. When a presentation is purely there out of the equilibrium of a phase, the wholeness of its complement occurs, and occurs whole-blown. With Ashvagosha, the quality that's there comes out of what he identified, not identified, but what he characterized as the storehouse consciousness. Later on, the Alara Kalama, which is for the storehouse consciousness, is very similar to one of the great yogis of the Buddha's time. The pronunciation, the words sound like the name of one of the great yogis of the Buddha's time. One of the first yogis that the Buddha goes to deliver because he had been a teacher of his. It indicates that out of this comes this quality of being able to respond, of resonance reaching the level of a consonance. And what happens with a consonance, that while a resonance disperses itself on the horizon, a consonance is spherical and takes itself to every order, to every horizon. One can have a consonance if one strikes the whole chord. One has a resonance if one strikes a note. The Buddha's wholeness is on level of consonance. So that the reciprocity was not just a reciprocity of like to like, of similar to similar, but of everything to anything. Which makes of it a rather glorious quality. Here's how the Satipatthana Sutra gives in part the technique in a running line-by-line commentary. And how does this happen? One who is forest gone, one who has gone through the root of a tree, one who has gone to an empty place, sits down, cross-legged, holding his back erect, arousing mindfulness in front of him. Mindful, he breathes in. Mindful, he breathes out. Long. Contemplates long. Breathes in, mindful. Breathes out, mindful. Short. Comprehends short. Trains himself, thinking, I shall breathe in. I shall experience the whole body. Trains himself, thinking, I shall breathe out. Experiences the whole body. Trains himself, thinking, I shall breathe in. Tranquilizing the activity of the body. Trains himself, thinking, I shall breathe out. Tranquilizing the activity of the body. Thus, the four jhanas arise: body, feelings, mind, mental objectiveness. Body, ritual, feelings, myth, mind, symbols, mental objectiveness, vision. It's this quality, this foursome that occurs. It does not occur in time. It does not occur in a linear seriality, but occurs, we would use the English term, spontaneously. And the spontaneously has a very peculiar quality to it. reality never is a thing, but always at its most poignant is a pair. And the pair is always related together as a ratio. And in spontaneity, there is a common denominator to every ratio, and the common denominator is 0. In spontaneity, the common denominator of every ratioed occurrence is 0 or infinity. Can be either way. Integrally, it's 0. Differentially, it's infinity. To an enlightened mind, the cosmos is everywhere that any ratio occurs, because the common denominator is infinity. To the enlightened mind, the integral cycle of nature is always Tao-based. Now, one says in the Buddhist tradition that the Buddha thereby coming into the ability to speak turned the Dharma chakra. It's just like the illustration of Panku that we began with in the Chinese Taoist version. And incidentally, this Taoist image does not occur in China before the 3rd century AD. After the introduction of Buddhism into China, the Chinese sinified Buddhism and made the mythological image of the Tai Chi in the hands of Panku very much on the order of the Buddha turning the Dharma chakra. When the frozen circle of a regressive, ritual-based rut is turned even one slight bit, the entire structure begins to rotate and loses its frozenness. And immediately what is released are the differential powers of consciousness. As soon as a regressive rut is fractured, even to the smallest nuance, its ability to remain static is completely gone forever. So that the only way it can be maintained is to reinstate it by a re-indoctrinization, by a reminder, by a reinforcement. And if there's no reminder, no reinforcement, no re-indoctrinization, then that rut of ritual ignorance continues to crumble. If one let it go completely, it would vanish, leaving not even a trace of soot. Generally, the cracks and fractures that occur in ritual ignorance are done in a context where there is no encouragement for differential consciousness, and there is also no recursive attentiveness to the natural development that really underlies the entire cycle. And so in a sociologically indoctrinated world, it's very difficult to become free, because every instance of a move towards freedom is considered a jeopardization, and anything that would carry on beyond just a fleeting moment, an intuition that's quickly covered up, a stray insight that is unremembered, a penetration which is not allowed to grow. In that kind of world, human beings are enslaved. They are not enslaved to a master, but they are enslaved to this impersonal cycle of ignorance. The freeing of anyone from that cycle discloses the ability of everyone to be freed from that cycle. And generally in human history, when a way of freedom is shown, the cycle of ignorance itself seeks to impose and reimpose itself with greater vigor. And in this is the seed of victory, because the greater vigor can only come from an increased energy. And so the more that a closed society energizes itself to fight off those who would interfere with it, the more energy becomes distributed throughout its entire system, and the more difficult it becomes to maintain its status quo. And all by itself, it energizes itself to the point to where people begin to wake up like popcorn popping all over the place. This has happened many times in human history. So very often, the hero is not directly responsible for the triumph, but is indirectly responsible by just having provided sufficient aggravation. This is the way of the trickster. This trickster is a figure who understands that keep aggravating the situation, keeping on aggravating, eventually leads to an increased energization, which itself gives more and more opportunity. This kind of hero who goes back into the situation in the Greek typology is called a terrestrial hero, whereas another version is the celestial hero. The terrestrial hero always goes back to continue to help. The celestial hero cracks the form and then leaves forever, knowing that what has been cracked will never be put back together again. Generally, at the turn of an aeon, there is a celestial hero, like a Krishna, like a Jesus. But in the more common version, they're terrestrial heroes like the Buddha, who simply return again and again to keep weaving the woven words to reparent the entire situation. We live in a time where both qualities are needed. Both kinds of heroes are needed. And we will, all of us, live to see a time early in the 21st century that was once characterized by a cartoon in the British humor magazine Punch. In the cartoon, there were two figures that were speaking to each other in an urban setting. And in the background, in the sky, above all the buildings, were about 200 flying, caped superheroes. And the caption was, "I pity the wrongdoers on a night like this." Thank you. More next week.